The first Reconstruction was based on a decision that was made to grant blacks certain rights: the right to vote, the right to hold public office. And once they got into those offices, particularly voting and in public office, and they served in offices at the local, state, and federal level. You had a few senators, you had a few in Congress. But they passed things like free public education, things like that empowered. In the South, it was the first time that education was free. But the key reason they passed it was that the South wanted to wage a war now economically. And the North's economic interests were threatened, and the only way they could be preserved was through empowering black people. And by the way, during this time, blacks were armed in the South. You had militias. Those militias were there to support Reconstruction governments. And those were Civil War veterans who could shoot. If they pointed a gun in a certain direction, you dead. They weren't just protecting Reconstruction governments, they were protecting their families. And you had militias in Mississippi, which is the largest population of blacks in the country and the most vicious. And blacks were there to match fire with fire. And you had them in South Carolina, and you had struggles in Louisiana. So this was the first Reconstruction. And the key victory we gained there was we freed ourselves. And in the case where whites were evenly divided, we determined the outcome. And in fact, without 179,000 black, bold men, this country would be different. So that's the first Reconstruction. The second Reconstruction starts in 1954 when black people rise up in the Montgomery bus boycott and then start a black freedom movement that kicks off at a heavy level with the student sit-ins and spreads across the country. The key point about this period is black people secure the first victory against white supremacy. The first victory. They tear down Jim Crow, or what we would call Southern segregation, or more properly, Southern style apartheid. They defeated it with a series of jiu-jitsu moves. Very smart. The point is, that was a great victory. Now, at the time in which blacks fought in the Civil War, the tide of history was against them. White people all over the world had power. But at the time of the victory in the Black Freedom Movement, the tide of history had changed. It had changed. The head of Britain had gone through Africa. And what he said was that there are winds of change blowing in Africa. He said that Africans now have a sense of freedom. And so he said, there's nothing you can do about this. And this wind of change was sweeping Asia, and it has swept Cuba. I was a student at San Francisco State, brainwashed, but I sure did love that Cuban Revolution. I wasn't that brainwashed, you know? And so what you need to understand is, when we look at these two Reconstructions, the period you're in now, the tide is in your favor. Black people stood up when the tide was so bad you could drown. And that's literally what happened to us for 100 years. Under this Jim Crow, under bulldozing, under murder, under segregation. But black people stood strong. But now, in this second Reconstruction, blacks are fighting to get back what they lost in the beginning and end of the first post-Reconstruction. And that is what Reconstruction is about. It is about securing rights. And so in the case of the Black Freedom Movement, they rendered a defeat to white supremacy. And that was the key thing that characterized that particular period. And so what we see is that during this period, there is a defensive posture that whites take. They're on the defensive. And this particular defensive posture is a posture in which whites, particularly the right wing, your president, they know that they were defeated in the 60s. And they have a ideology and a psychology of dispossession. You need to understand that. You need to understand that the right wing that is now attacking Black Lives Matter demonstrators are actually in a defensive position. And they have this sense of dispossession because they now know they no longer have exclusive control over the USA. And that's a fact. They will tell you that. And they're so defensive that some of them are prepared to live in one state. And I think that's a great idea, at least for the white supremacists. I could even give you one. Call me up. Now, how defensive could you get? You ran everything in this country, and now you see there's a steamroller coming. And that steamroller is one, Black power. That steamroller is the Black freedom movement. And what they see is they're afraid. But the second steamroller is immigration. 1965, Black people did not call for the Immigration Act, but Johnson and others felt out of step with history. After all, segregation was an embarrassment, and we did it in. And so now they said, well, let's be liberal. Let's open the country up. Now, you know, Lyndon Johnson was no liberal. And by the way, for those that think you can't work with a Biden, we worked with Johnson. We put pressure on his butt. That's what got a voting rights bill. That's what got a civil rights bill. You don't talk about someone that you're going to put pressure on has to be in love with you. All they have to be is exposed to you. Exposed in a way that you can kick their behind. And I'm telling you, we've got a movement going on, a wind in our back. We'll get into that later. And it gives you the basis for putting demands on a Biden administration. And if you think you can demand anything of Donald Trump, his mother couldn't even tell him anything. His advisors can't even tell him anything. In fact, his Secretary of State Tillerson called him a moron. And I think that that might be an understatement. A moron is president. You understand? Any Black person who holds back on this election after you know what time it is, you're going to have to ask a question to your children. They're going to ask you, Daddy, Mama, what did you do in 2020? Did you stand up for my rights? And if you got the wrong answer, sorry for you. So it's a question of smoke or a vote. Smoke, talking jive. There ain't no difference between these two candidates. When I get through, if you don't see some differences, and if you don't see the differences already, then I'm sorry for you. So the thing is, we got to understand that the second Reconstruction is coming up during a time of global change, And it's a time where Africans are rising. Here's the other thing to understand about this era. In the first period of the first Reconstruction and then the first post-Reconstruction, 1876, whites were on the high tide. So they weren't on the rise, they were in power. But with World War I, Britain fell. They became a debtor nation. That is the key indication of decline. By the way, America's a debtor nation now. It's in debt to China. Shipped its manufacturing there and is now complaining about Chinese power. So what you have to understand is that in this era, we are in a period in which the West has fallen and America is in decline and falling. And by 2044, Black, brown, red, and yellow people will be a majority in this country. And by that time, China will be the foremost power in the world. And there's nothing they can do about it. So what you need to understand is you're in the high tide of history. So it's a question if you go with the wave and take advantage of the motion in the ocean. You hear me? And if you do that, you're going to swim on the side of freedom. And if you don't, you'll be drowned. Like a lot of these little puppets running around here talking about they like Trump, or they don't really care about this election. They don't really care. And that's when you have power. Somebody's going to bust into your house and rape your wife, and you're going to say, I ain't got no power, man. You know what I mean? What kind of chump are you? I'm telling you what's getting ready to happen, because this is the second post-Reconstruction. We're going to get into this in a minute. It's worse than rape, because it ain't just raping one wife, it's raping a people. And it's worse than that. So that's the first thing about this period. This is the high tide for us.